simply giving up and telling Zelensky it's over is not that straightforward an option for him. He's more likely to have to enter into some kind of negotiation with Vladimir Putin to bring this to an end.
Now, Mark Urban is here, as he is every Monday, to talk through the big foreign policy, diplomatic and defence stories. Hello, Mark. Welcome back.
Morning. Good to see you.
Good to be with you. Thank you, Mark. Look, you've written in the Sunday Times yesterday about 5 forces limiting Donald Trump's global influence. Let's start with the first, events beyond his control. What sort of events is Donald Trump going to find beyond his control, do you think?
Well, I think we always, particularly in a presidential election campaign, people, shall we say, don't understate the importance of the office. And clearly it is the most important elected office in the world. But there are limits, and there are all sorts of things that can go wrong and can creep up on you and completely upset all your calculations. I mean, if you remember the Biden administration's position about the Middle East, in the summer of 2023, it was basically, oh, that's all calm and stable and job done and all the rest of it. And after October the 7th, all their calculations were changed. It became a huge problem internationally. It became a huge military commitment for the US. There's always a difference between what you'd like to do and what you find yourself doing for a US president.
Well, I mean, I guess with Trump, maybe it comes down to the question of how he responds to events that are outside his control. Because on the one hand, he's got this sort of streak of American isolationism, you might call it, in him. But on the other hand, he's not going to want to look weak, and he's not going to want to look foolish, and he's not going to make America want to make America look weaker than it was beforehand. So I guess it depends on how he responds to any crisis that comes upon him, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good point. And also, I think that idea of not wanting to look weak or frankly, too much of a sucker, that runs so counter to his political philosophy and the way he's sold himself to the American people that on Ukraine, for example, simply giving up and telling Zelensky it's over is not that straightforward an option for him. He's more likely to have to enter into some kind of negotiation with Vladimir Putin to bring this to an end. And there will be limits on what Putin will accept and what, of course, Volodymyr Zelensky will accept. At a certain point, either actor may just say, nope, we go back to the battlefield. So those factors are all there. He clearly doesn't want to seem weak. But as we know, during his first term, and this was one of the things that was advertised during his campaign, he was not a frequent user of the American military instrument. He was involved in finishing off the Islamic State group and authorized one or two rather high-profile operations, like killing the Iranian Revolutionary Guards General Qasem Soleimani. But he was not a particularly frequent user of military force, for example.
How much do we know about exactly where he is with both with Putin and Zelensky? Because, I mean, the Washington Post reported that he spoke to Putin on Thursday and warned him not to escalate the war any further. But then the Kremlin seems to be denying that this call ever took place. So that seems already all quite murky, right?
Yes. I mean, Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman for Putin, said this morning that this phone call was an imagined event or something of that ilk. It's an interesting one, that. I mean, certainly the Trump campaign did not give any sort of formal readout of a call with Putin. But as you say, it's the Washington Post that said it happened. I think we're going to have to wait out on that one, frankly, because it's one of those he said, she said situation where we can't easily see the truth. But I would suspect, if the Kremlin's denied it, that it may not be what it was presented as in the paper.
That's a very polite way of saying that we can trust the Kremlin's version of events, perhaps more than Donald Trump's here.
Well, it's hard to. I think it's just hard to. No, I'm not sure Trump said it that it had happened. I mean, I think possibly it was someone in his entourage who briefed the. But I mean, well, listen, if the Kremlin denies it flat out, I think one has to be suspicious about what actually happened.
We also know that he spoke to Volodymyr Zelensky with Elon Musk on the line as well. That seems astonishing.
Yeah, I mean, you can say an unconventional way of doing business. I mean, I read into this a bit more, and allegedly, what happened is that for a short part of the call, Donald Trump passed the phone to Musk, and there was a quick discussion between Musk and Zelensky about such things as access to this Starlink
Mm.
communication system, which is very important to the Ukrainian military. And once or twice in the past, there have been suggestions from Ukraine that Musk was limiting their access to it. So yeah, that seems to have happened. I mean, you'd say, well, yeah, it's a very unusual way of conducting business, but this whole emergent negotiation is a very unusual way of conducting business. I mean, if you go by the book, the president-elect should not be conducting foreign policy conversations like talking to Zelensky and allegedly talking to Putin until he's in office. I mean, about the terms of a possible deal on Ukraine. But I think it's very obvious that Trump really wants to get things moving very quickly, and he's not going to take any notice of that kind of restriction. I mean, we know, for example, on Wednesday that he's going to the White House to start the transition process. But we also know a lot of people around Trump are now saying, are looking to change procedure about whether they can get the people, their nominees for the key posts, like the Secretary of State and, the Secretary of Commerce, all those sorts of jobs, into the jobs for sort of day one. Because during Trump 1.0, months and months passed before many of the nominees had been through their confirmation process. This is the process by which an administration has to send key figures forward to be approved by Congress in the posts that they've been appointed to.
Yeah, indeed. Look, you also write that that another factor Trump's going to have to contend with is that the U.S. military is weaker than it was when he was last in power. What's happened to the U.S. military to weaken it so?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. And it's another thing which I think journalists tend to sort of, well, they either overlook it or, frankly, they're a bit behind the times about the extent to which American military power really has diminished in the last 10, 15 years. It's interesting, for example, that one of the current issues in the Middle East is that America is finding it very hard to sustain a presence of 2 aircraft carriers on duty at any one time. So just dealing with possible contingencies with Iran there is stretching them a bit. And if you look at Ukraine, one of the issues that's emerged, and this is why the Biden administration is trying to sort of throw weapons out the door before Trump takes over formally on the 20th of January, is that the bigger part of what hasn't been delivered yet are supposed to be off-the-shelf weapons from US military stores, so-called drawdown. And basically, the Pentagon is not letting them go because it feels with certain types of weapons like the Patriot anti-aircraft missile, that type of thing, it's got too few left. And the answer to your question is that over the long term, it's a combination of underinvestment in stocks, what American military people call magazine depth. And the other thing, of course, is because of the last 2.5+ years of the Ukraine war, they've been using up an awful lot of the stocks they did have. And that ranges from the sort of mundane, almost everyday items like shells for artillery, right the way through to these very expensive items like the Patriot, which, if you want to buy a new missile like that, you're talking about $4 to $5 million a piece. And they haven't succeeded in getting production up enough to replace those stocks and simultaneously keep sending a lot to Ukraine. They have got the production up a bit on things like artillery shells, but it's still not up high enough. So that's a very real factor. And in fact, Trump addressed this in a video yesterday about his plans for national defense, which contained lots of interesting details, including, for example, his approach to the Ukraine negotiation. But yes, the refilling the magazines, the storage places for munitions and all of that kind of thing was very high on his list. But he also said for example, that it would be unhinged, was the word he used, at the moment to let Ukraine join NATO. So, I mean, that gives some sense about his approach to that negotiation with Zelensky. I think Trump is among those people who is all for arming Ukraine and trying to ensure that its forces are strong enough, if there's an armistice, to resist the Russians if war breaks out again in a few years' time, but does not believe in having them in NATO.
I mean, speaking of NATO generally and NATO funding, it's often and repeatedly said that European governments are sort of lagging behind in their commitments. Is that still true? I mean, most European nations are now over the 2% that they're required, and European spending on defence sort of, I think, vastly dwarfs Russian spending on defence. So is it still true that America is kind of making up a shortfall that Europeans aren't willing to spend, or is that just historically true?
Oh, gosh. Well, that's a big question. I mean, when you talk about the amount spent, you're right. I mean, it always used to be said in the UK, for example, that, oh, we're the fifth or sixth highest spender of defence in the world, and the second highest in NATO, to which I always used to think, well, we get pretty bad value then in terms of what we actually manage to field and our stocks of munitions and all that sort of thing. Britain now is somewhere in the middle of the NATO 28 nations. And so a lot of them have increased. I think if you look at the map, the thing that's really salient is the closer you are to Russia, the more you get it about spending significant amounts of money on defense. So the Poles are committing almost twice the level that we are as a proportion of their economy. You get further away, and the real people who will come under scrutiny from a Trump administration are people like the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Canadians, the people further away who are still well below 2% of the economy being spent on defense. So undoubtedly that will come. And it was another feature of that Trump broadcast or video yesterday about national defense, this question of burden sharing. And also, I think what they're trying to do, or what they will try and do as their sort of centerpiece of their defense and security policy is, once again, and we've heard this from previous presidents, shift the focus to the Pacific, to working out how they're going to deal with China if it ever gets to that kind of thing militarily. Which inevitably, given the limited means at their disposal, means drawing down in Europe and asking European members of NATO to spend more. So that undoubtedly is going to become a sort of hot potato for Keir Starmer's government in the coming months.
And look, the final factor you mentioned in your column that might shape Trump's foreign policy was the degree to which the trade war he's hell-bent on having could derail his entire platform anyway, which means perhaps negotiations with other countries are going to be all about that and not about defence at all. Or do you think he intends to sort of combine them together?
I think he does. I mean, it's all part of a worldview, isn't it? We saw this during the first term, this kind of idea that America is being taken for a ride. And it's applied to trade and it's applied to defense spending. I think there's sort of double whammy of, and this is another change in the power political situation since his first term, this huge indebtedness that America now has, which is costing them an enormous amount just to service the debt. I mean, 17% of federal government spending at the moment is just servicing the debt. Now, that means limited money, I think, to borrow or to spend on defense, and therefore inevitably pressure on the NATO, other members of NATO, to spend more. When it comes to the tariff wars, I mean, he talked on the campaign trail of a sort of global 20%, but up to 60% on China. Now, this seems to run counter to so many other things he's trying to do, because, it could cause an enormous amount of inflation as providers of various goods and services increase their prices to take goods, I should say, to take account of tariffs. And of course, that has an inflationary effect, as indeed could the deportation of millions of people, undocumented migrants. Once you take loads of people out of the labor force and the wage rates have to go up, that could also have an inflationary effect. So we don't really know how he's going to try and square the macroeconomic circle. But I think with regard to foreign policy, undoubtedly, if he slaps 60% tariffs on China, which, by the way, Elon Musk has been publicly arguing against, and you would think he has some weight with Trump, then yeah, I mean, it will accentuate this idea of a very hostile administration from the Chinese point of view coming into power in Washington, and of there being an increased sense of confrontation between the two countries.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much indeed, Mark Urban. You can, of course, hear Mark at this time every Monday, and you can read him in the Sunday Times every week. And while we were talking, Lorraine got in touch, and she says, Mark Urban is such a great contributor and a terrific addition to the Times Radio team. So knowledgeable and engaging, helps me make sense of complex matters. I could listen to him all day long. You and me both, Lorraine. I think so.